Slides 11 through 16 discuss the rules of sociological research. We could call it the guides to sociological research. The first of these guides or rules of sociological research is that sociologists follow the basic rules for scientific method. That is, we seek to make certain that the information we gather is going to be accurate, actual facts, and not conjecture. The idea is to make certain that each piece of information or each datum is accurate and is completed accurately and is stored accurately and used accurately so that the entire group of information or data are accurate and believable. Please notice how we have used the two words datum and data. Datum is one piece of information. It is singular. Data is the entire body of information, facts that have been gathered, and is expressed data are. Sociology avoids using anecdotes or stories to mold our view of a situation or even the way that we teach or disperse that information. The reason is that stories can often conceal truth or even convey untruth. For example, some friends of mine who believe strongly in what's called spiritual warfare also hold a belief that I don't totally agree with, that there are certain evil spirits that are very powerful and hold power in certain areas of the country. These spirits, they say, have to be dealt with in very special ways. One story they use to support their view of territorial spirits is from a town in Uruguay and Brazil. This town is right on the border. In fact, the border between the two countries goes right down one street. You can stand with the foot in Uruguay and the other foot in Brazil. The story says that the spirits are stronger and more active in Brazil than in Uruguay, just across the border, giving the idea that there are certain territorial spirits in Brazil that are not that active in Uruguay. Visiting this town, I noticed that there were 3 stores in Uruguay selling the paraphernalia used by spiritists, and over on the Brazil side there was only one store that sold this material. Asking the people about it, I found the people said, "Oh, the evil spirits are much more active in Uruguay. You must be much more careful here than in Brazil." When I asked my friends about this, they said, "You know, we know that story is inaccurate, but one person told it and the rest of us picked it up. We now know the story is not accurate and we're no longer using it." This is a reason for not using stories. They can be inaccurate. The next slide is teaches us about how we're going to gather the materials, the data that we want to know, and we will study these different methods or designs to gather material in detail later in this unit. Just become acquainted with the words and the titles now, and we will learn them more in the days to come. But experiments, surveys, historical materials, content analysis of printed and materials such as movies, interviews, participant observation, longitudinal studies. These are the ways that we gather material. The next several slides tells us that sociology uses both deductive and inductive reasoning. I will highly recommend that you go to the space or the address at the bottom of this slide, number 13, and watch this YouTube presentation on deductive and inductive reasoning. As you watch it, don't worry too much about the mathematics involved. Just try to get the idea of deductive and inductive reasoning. The difference is basically this. Deductive reason proceeds from a demonstrable fact and goes on to the next and comes to a conclusion. There's little emotion in it. Inductive reason, on the other point, goes from something specific to something more general. We notice a progression. If someone says 2, 4, 6, 8, then we might very quickly say, oh, 10 would be the next number because they've been going up by 2 and going to the next full number or complete number. So inductive reason has a little bit of Max Weber's Verstein in it. The next slide shows a diagram. The top one is deductive reasoning, starting from a theory, a belief, to a hypothesis, to an observation, and then confirming it's like this. On the other hand, inductive reason begins from an observation, notices a pattern, makes a tentative hypothesis, and then comes to a belief or a theory or a teaching. The next slide speaks about deductive reasoning as it goes from a top-down approach, we might call it. We think up a theory about our topic of interest, narrow it down to more specific hypotheses we can test, narrow it down to observations that address the hypothesis, and ultimately we confirm whether our original idea was correct or not. Inductive reasoning, on the next slide, says that you go from specific observations to generalizations. It's a bottoms-up approach. And we begin with specific observations and detect patterns and regularities and form some idea. Durkheim used something of an inductive reasoning approach in his study on suicide. He studied the people who had committed suicide, and he noticed that there were more Protestants than Catholics. He noticed there were more single than married. He noticed there were more out of work than people who had jobs, and he began to work on an idea that said all of these people were lacking in social relationships. That's what inclined them to suicide, and from that he went to his general idea or theory that behavior is governed by social relationships, not by other matters. Now, deductive reasoning goes the other way. If you read Sherlock Holmes stories, and you should, you will hear Holmes talking with Watson in one story. And Watson expresses his disagreement with or his concern about the idea of deductive reasoning, says it won't work. And Holmes tells him, well, observation tells me that you went to the 23rd Street post office this morning, but deduction tells me you went there to send a telegram. Well, that's absolutely true, said Watson, but how do you know? Well, Holmes said, I see on your pants leg a certain color of clay, and the only place that kind of clay is in this neighborhood is at the 23rd Street post office, where they've recently dug a ditch. I've been sitting here in the room with you this morning, and I have not seen you write a letter. And I see your desk, and I see you've got stamps and envelopes and everything that would need to write a letter. So you didn't go to the post office to mail a letter, and you didn't go to buy stamps or postage stamps. The only other reason you could go to the post office would be to send a telegram. So I deduce that that's why you went. We use both of these in sociology, and we would need to understand them well. So sociology as a scientific study seeks to make very certain that we gather real data, that we guard it carefully, study it sincerely, and accurately understand what the data is saying so that we can present our views in a scientific way. Sociology uses the scientific method.